Hello, everyone, and welcome to week 12. This week, we look at decolonizing discourses with Agazzino, Baker Bell, and Rossino and Huey. And of course, we like to always ground ourselves in the bigger picture, the bigger idea of how everything comes together in our course. When we're doing the weekly reading and the weekly discussion board where we're working through the ideas in the literature and seeing what others have to say about that. We're reading with that dual purpose to understand the socio-cultural perspective on literacy and how to do the ethnographic research on the literacy practices around us and ideas that we can apply to our own 123 project. So I like to always ground us in the bigger ideas of how our course comes together. So I'm starting with Agazzino 2020, Fuck the Law, and the particular discourse here that he looks at is one of law and criminology. Um, and specifically, he goes about deconstructing our society's love of the law or love of law and order, nomophilia, as being colonized and perhaps we could say deficient in its limited view of what law and order can be. So I guess that's nomophilitis, right? An itis of our nomophilia. Um, so I'm posing the question to you, does he make the case for the importance of decolonizing this discourse um, from this notion of discipline and punish to one based on an ethic of love, and how important that is that he is telling us what this would lead to, because the colonized discourse has taken us historically down another path. So this is a challenging article to read, especially if you've not read his work before. I've read it a couple times. I reread it each semester. Um, and I just find every time I reread it, I get into it a little more deeply. But Agazzino is really going about showing how our American westernized ideal of what the law is kind of based on this only one rather narrow understanding of what it could be. Next, we'll talk about Rossino and Huey, and the discourse that we situate their study in is the war on drugs. And I'm making a lot of connections between this article and the Agazzino article because the war on drugs would certainly fall into the larger discourse of law and criminology that Agazzino is deconstructing in his article. But our scholars here are looking in particular at how media construct debates around the war on drugs, the pros and the cons, and also the language about the war on drugs. They do a content analysis and determine its very racialized language. Racialized identities are constructed in this discourse. So now they're looking at different media critiques, and they find that critiques are often framed as a fiscal issue or freedom and justice issue, um, a function issue. We would all be crackheads if the war on drugs wasn't working, right? So this disconnect between their content analysis being racialized, but yet media critiques seem to be silent on race. They call their big theme that emerges as racial silence. So my connection that I'll bring out in the discussion board and that you can think about as well, and you can read them in any order. You don't have to read one before the other, but um, Agazino, we were talking about nomophilitis, right? An itis or a sickness of our North American, Americanized, Westernized love of the law as being a deficient view that's colonized by our European ancestors and some of the other texts that Agazino deconstructs. And here we might also wonder if the media critiques were also um, sickened, have an itis about their love of the law, and be also limited by this colonized lens. That's not part of Rossino and Huey's writing. I'm making that connection there, and I'm going to make it in the discussion board. Um, Something else to think about here with this article, go back and read their data and methodology section. Read it first for its content and go back and skim it again. They are doing a content analysis of the language around the war on drugs. And it's not the same framework. We do our critical discourse analysis with Hilary Jenks, but it's very interesting. And what you might take away from it is the author's attitude toward the subject, the way they talk about their finding, the way they talk about language being racialized and constructing racialized identities, the way they're phrasing things, because I am putting you into the discourse of sociocultural literature, right? So that's my colonizing of your paper. Anyway, have fun with this one. I think it's a little bit easier read than Agazino, or I don't know, it's more straightforward, but lots of crossover in the ideas. I happen to have read Agazino first and then Rossino Huey, but read them in the order you choose. And in the third article this week, and I don't know why I call it the third article, there is no prescribed order in which you have to read them. I guess it's just the order of the slides. I call it the third. We have Baker Bell 2020, and the discourse she is looking at is English language arts curriculum, high school curriculum, I believe. And what she's really working toward is deconstructing this curriculum of white mainstream American English, white mainstream English, we might say standard American English, and how that's really committing like language and identity violence against students for whom this have a heritage language, or that this is not their home language, but in particular African American students who speak what she calls Black language and must code switch in school to the quote unquote academic language of school, which is white mainstream English, between that and Black language, and interrogating, why is this the case, and how does the big our use of white mainstream American English, what is it doing? What kind of violence is it committing to identity and the language of people who are multilinguals? And this hits close to home for me because I'm a former ESOL teacher, and I'm also connecting this article back to Hillary Jenks's um, work, she talks about the access paradox. So this is not in Baker Bell. This is me making a connection here, and you can go back and look. It's written about on page 24 in the Hillary Jenks book. If you've got a paper copy, it might be different in the digital copy. But the access paradox, Jenks is saying, we need to teach students forms of standard English so that we can bring them into the discourses of power and teach them how to operate and understand how language works in discourses of power where the valued form of language would be she's from South Africa, so in her case it's British English, but for us we could say standard American English. And by not teaching them these forms of standardized English, we would be, and I'm using her word, ghettoizing them. um, so it's this paradox. If we're going to teach them, are we also committing this harm against them, and are we killing their heritage language? And Baker Bell doesn't get at that too much. She mostly looks at decolonizing curriculum in such a way that there's space for Black language, is what she's calling it, interrogating the idea of why some students must code switch between their own language and the language that's valued at school. But keep in mind the Hillary Jenks access paradox as well, because it just presents, a dilemma. And Baker Bell is not saying not to teach standard forms of English. I believe here she's saying we need to open up curriculum to allow for other forms, and this is good for all students. Anyway, very interesting article, shorter. It's got some, pedagogical tools, lesson plans, interesting things in there that you might even think about taking for your own practice in some way. So this is our final week with the literature and the weekly discussion board. After this week, we focus only on the project. So I really want to get as much as we can out of our discussion board this week. And I mentioned in my audio clips on some of the other slides, I was going to be making some connections across the articles. For example, the Rossino Huey article about the war on drugs and the Agazzino article about love of the law and criminology discourse. I think there's some ideas that go back and forth there. And then also with the Baker Bell article about decolonizing the English language arts curriculum, and the connection back to Hillary Jenks and the access paradox. So, I'll give you page numbers and connections back, but I'm going to ask you to do that as well. We've come a long way and covered a lot of territory with our literature focused on these broad ideas of what a text can be using our sociocultural lens. Like in this case, this week, our quote unquote texts are these larger discourses around these topics like law and order and ELA curriculum. And also looking for, lots of depth. The suggested length of the discussion board post is, 300, 350 words, which I guess is close to like a page, double space, 12-point font, if 2 or 3 paragraphs minimum to actually share your ideas. You are also welcome to submit an audio file if you would prefer to do it that way. If that saves you time, if it helps you construct your ideas better, and you hear me making uhs and ums, and it doesn't need to be a perfectly scripted audio file. But if you would prefer to do that, you are welcome to complete the discussion board weekly work as audio files. And this is going to wrap up, as I said, our final weekly work with the literature. And speaking of the projects, they're always near and dear to us, right? So just kind of helping you pace yourself. Where should you be with your project right now? I would say finalizing data collection, step two, right? Data collection would be your open-ended interviews, your artifacts, gathering images or a digital copy of your focal text. Um, I continue to encourage you to draw from the literature, thinking about things like the author's, writing styles and tone, the phrasing they use when they're talking about literacy practices. And I'm smiling because I know a lot of us, and I may have been doing it as well, we're saying either literacy process instead of literacy practice, or I read a couple people wrote literary process, and it is literacy practice. Um, we're also thinking about the labels we use to represent different groups and different people, again, trying to not use like judgmental kinds of or qualifying kinds of language, but instead just descriptive to the extent possible. And then again, when you start your analysis, you should be kind of at this tipping point between finishing data collection and beginning analysis, although we do talk about these things as happening simultaneously. But direction for analysis, again, I encourage you to, just because of the limited scope of the project, the mini case study, to just find one big theme that seems to emerge, power, resistance, whatever that may be. Maybe something is colonized. If you are invigorated by the idea of colonization and decolonization and you want to make some tweaks, I want you to go for it. But keep these ideas in mind about where you should be with your project at this point. So this brings us to the end of the current mini lecture, as well as all of the mini lectures of the weekly work. Although again, I always encourage you to go back, revisit the mini lectures if you really feel like sitting through it and listening to it. I hope you do. But please go back and revisit any of the literature that really stands out to you, that's memorable to you for one reason or another. Um, Mine the reference lists of those articles for other scholarly work that might be applicable to your final paper. Take a look at the annotated bibliography in the project module. Some of the annotations are better than others. My goal was to at least get the reference there, and some of them don't have a very helpful annotation by them, but it's a constantly growing list of a lot of the big, well-known articles and scholars, among others, that write about literacy with the sociocultural lens. Um, there's also articles, optional weekly reading. There are some good articles tucked in there, articles that were used in the past and now they've been replaced with something else, but they're still good and we just can't fit it all in. Looking a little bit further ahead, the final project presentation is due on April 23rd. We're doing that also with the VoiceThread presentation gallery. So your primary audience for that presentation is your peers, the group here, and you're going to present it in a very similar way. We're going to do the PQS feedback in a very similar way. And as always, if you are feeling stuck or if you're just not sure about your next steps, I am happy to have a Zoom meeting with you or a phone call if that's your preference. If you just want to talk it out and you want me to listen and kind of make sure, are you going in the right direction, anything like that, I am happy to do it. I keep notes on everybody's projects. I hope I'm keeping up with it, but we're a very small group. I really enjoy working on the projects with you. I hope I'm not colonizing your projects, so you have to put a wall up and stop me from doing that. I'm smiling. I will hold myself back from doing that. But please don't wait, sooner rather than later, for that. Thanks.